afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. This is the time of year when temperatures hit their highest, and with the heat and humidity come questions about livestock. So today we've called on two guests who can help us understand how various livestock respond to heat and how farmers can best manage their animals in response to climbing temperatures. Joining me are Joe Emenheiser and Jenn Colby. Joe is the UVM Extension Livestock Specialist and Jenn is the Pasture Program Coordinator for UVM Extension Center for Sustainable Agriculture. Thanks to both of you. So Joe, what about livestock and heat? Do all animals, livestock, need shelter?
The simple answer to the question is not necessarily. It's a really complex issue with a lot of different factors that most people observing animals outside in the sun might not think about. The breeds of livestock, the type of animals, their age, their health status, how acclimated they are to the heat, all come into play. And so ultimately, farmers are responsible for providing animals the ability to regulate their body temperature. But shade is just one way to do that, and nutrition, providing water, and a whole raft of other factors are equally or more important.
So when it's 95 degrees and it's high humidity and we're driving around and we see animals out in a pasture, there's more to it than just them standing out in a field.
Right, absolutely.
Can you give us some examples of when an animal might or might not need shade?
Well, again, that comes back to the other factors, and if diet and water are not able to give the animal the ability to thermoregulate, then shade is one way to do it. A diet can become too high in protein, and that can cause problems because of the amount of heat that it generates in digestion. And on the flip side of that, there can also be struggles with permanent shelters that are always available, because they become a concentration area for feces and urine and any bugs that the animals are carrying. So sometimes that can actually be counter to the overall health of the animal.
Do you agree with that, Jenn?
I absolutely do. I absolutely do. And I think that when an animal is lactating, when they're giving milk, they're at their highest nutritional need. And that can mean that their body is focused on producing milk, and so it also means that it can be harder for them to be able to handle excess heat. So that's a time when it might make sense to do shade. It also, we see this a lot in pasture management. Moving animals around in a pasture and with a good adequate amount of grass means that the soil itself is shaded, and it means that the animals' feet are cooled naturally because the soil itself is cooler and because the grasses continue to hold in that moisture. So that can actually be really good. And so it's sort of funny if you drive around and you see animals out in a pasture, if that was a fresh pasture that morning, that may be one of the best places for them to actually be, because they're not in those concentrations of manure. And even though they have less sun in those places, they're exposed to more other stressors. Sun is taken away as a stressor, but the other ones are added.
And the other part of keeping animals moving in a rotational system is that it keeps the forage quality of the grass so much better. And so instead of eating high protein residual, the composition of the feed in their gut is better for them to be able to thermoregulate.
Yep. Also, too, if you spend time around these large animals, you know that they give off a lot of body heat. So being close together in an enclosed structure, especially like a barn, just makes it almost like an oven.
Yeah, it really does.
And so let's talk a little bit about water.
Yep.
Water supplies, water sources. Obviously very important, but you were mentioning before we got started in this program, Jenn, that there's a tremendous amount of water content in the grass.
There is, as long as the grass there's an adequate amount of it. That's actually one of the places where we see, we always see the need to keep additional water in addition to grasses or forages available to the animals, because that will help them with their thermoregulation. But the other piece of that is that if animals are in a large continuous paddock, they say stay there for 3 weeks or a month, which is a fairly common system, then the animals eat the grasses down very short.
Right.
There's not a lot of water in that, in which case their needs, I see that with my own animals, if they're in a 2 or 3 day paddock, on the first day they need almost no water, and on the second or third day they start to suck down the water. And it's clearly that it's not the temperature, it's that there's less water in the grass.
Let's talk a little bit about dairy cows, because they're Vermont's dominant livestock. They have special needs in the extreme heat?
Their special needs really come from the high plane of nutrition that they have as lactating animals. So they actually they don't necessarily need shade, but they need to keep that plane of nutrition really, really high. And in some cases, we've certainly seen animals that seem to be very stressed because they're being asked to do a lot in terms of digestion of lower quality feed on top of producing lots of milk. So farmers see that dip in the tank if their nutrition and heat collide. That's very common.
And milk has a super high water content also.
Right, right.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
Of course it is.
But of course, in the wintertime, it's great to feed. You can even do lesser quality feed just because it helps with digestion, creates heat for the animals.
Right.
So that's a good thing, but not so great in the summertime.
Right.
And so what about sheep and all that wool? You see sheep out in the pasture and you say, oh, those poor things.
Actually, interestingly, that wool serves as an insulation layer in a lot of cases. Now, I still think it's best going into the extreme heat of the summer to shear and remove that fleece. But wool does have the ability to keep heat away from an animal. The interesting thing about sheep is that they did evolve as a desert animal. They have a lot of heat tolerance naturally, and you will see pictures of sheep in a circle all facing inward.
Yeah.
And they have a lot of ability to store water in those situations. They lower their activity down, and it helps them manage the heat.
Interesting. I hadn't even thought of that before. That's another point that comes up is people see these animals at the fair. A lot of times, maybe the only time they have contact with these animals, and they say, oh my goodness, they're so hot, they're in these hot barns. But there are also lots of fans in those barns, and ways to cool the animals off as well.
Yep, having that airflow is huge. It's one of the things about the barns that we have in Vermont and how they're really kind of built to keep air in or heat in the wintertime. So many of them, our barns are built for the wintertime.
Right.
And that fresh air moving, as much fresh air moving as possible, is what helps the animals thermoregulate, keeps them healthier, keeps bacteria and parasites from building up. Not necessarily parasites, but bugs. I mean, the
Flies.
Absolutely, that would be a parasite right there. Absolutely. So that's one of the. It's great when you hit a barn in the fair time when it can be warm. There can be cool days or there can be warm days, but they have those fans going and they have lots of water, and that's key between the two of those.
Are there situations where livestock should be brought inside or given alternative shade options?
It's one way to deal with that problem. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that if an animal is heat stressed already, moving that animal often can create even more stress. And so it's better to be proactive and to number one, make sure the animal is in a proper plane of nutrition and is acclimated to the heat. But yes, there are strategies bringing animals in. Sometimes they don't eat as much when they're brought in as they would outside. They don't like dry hay as much as they do green grass.
Right.
So that's something to keep in mind. And there's a difference in strategy really between fitting the animal to the farm and fitting the farm to the animal.
Can you explain that? What does that mean?
And so if you have a scenario that has limitations, filling that area with animals that have needs for things that the environment doesn't provide is not a wise idea.
So if you only have a couple of acres, you shouldn't get more than one cow or
Right.
one.
So
everyone.
overstocking is a major
Yeah.
cause of heat stress
Yeah.
because number one, just the sheer mass of animals in the area,
Right.
but then also the competition for nutrition and all the whole cascade of other factors that we talked about. And interestingly, there's a little bit of a derailment, but poultry, when they get too tight, they regulate their body temperature by spreading their wings out and expanding their ribs. And if they're packed to the point that they're not able to do that, that's when they have trouble with heat.
Interesting. Do livestock give off signs of heat stress?
They do. There's sort of the short term and the longer term, and the short term is their behavior patterns change. They eat less if it's really, really hot because they don't want to. Their bodies don't want to spend so much time digesting. They want to sort of conserve their energy. When they're really hot, they don't lay down because partly, so they sort of stand there. There's some panting. The photos on the screen are examples of a dairy farm that we visited in July of last year, and those cows were panting very heavily.
Is that like when a dog pants?
Kind of. Now the interesting part was it sort of feeds into what Joe was saying before about it being complicated to determine what the issues are, and sometimes they're too much heat and sometimes they're not. And in that case, it was a dairy farm and the farmer was grazing very, very short, which would bring it into the really high protein part of the grasses, which takes more energy to digest that. And when you get too much protein, that is essentially urea. We hear about urea, and that when an animal gets overloaded with that, they need to respirate to get rid of it. So the question was that a high heat situation, or was that, and it was a warm day, but it wasn't an unusually warm day, or was it a nutritional issue? And they had lots of water, and they weren't drinking any of it.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a mystery. So anyway, longer term, I don't know if Joe wanted to talk about longer term.
What I was going to add was that, yes, animals use those signs to help regulate their body temperature, but that's not necessarily causal or indicative all the time of heat stress. Right. It's just a sign that they are doing what they can physiologically to deal with the heat. And so the signs of heat stress really are elevated body temperatures and then to some extent elevated respiration. But body temperature is the big one. And I think that's one of the difficulties that we have when we're looking at animals from the outside of the fence, of telling really if
you're going to get in there with a thermometer
and catch them.
If they are struggling with heat stress. And so longer term, there are a lot of interesting studies that show that animals that have exposure only to a short-term period of heat have the opportunity to cool down overnight.
Right, when the nights get cool.
Or have a cool day in between. They suffer a whole lot less in terms of their survival, production, reproduction than an animal that's exposed to a long period of heat stress. And the other interesting thing there is that when an animal is struggling, it takes time to get back on track, and so oftentimes we're not seeing the larger picture of where they've been, where they're going with it.
So you'd say, though, the bottom line is if folks are concerned about animals out in a pasture, there's probably more than meets the eye to...
Absolutely, and there are times when animals should come into a shady area, certainly if they've got illness, if they've got injury, if they're stressed in many other ways and their bodies are healing. There are times when it's appropriate.
Okay, well, I want to thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.